The Pursuer at the Coffee Shop. Hani, a 23-year-old legal assistant, lived a life filled with routine, working at a small law firm, lunch breaks at the local Starbucks, and quiet evenings alone in her apartment. Every weekday at lunch, Hani stopped by the same Starbucks. It was a small, cozy, familiar place, with the usual bustling crowd grabbing their drinks. Behind the counter, Randall, a barista, worked diligently. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Every day, Randall would take Hani's order, remember her name, and write it on her cup. But over time, things began to change. Instead of just her name, he started drawing little hearts over the I in Hani, small gestures most wouldn't notice, but she did. As the weeks passed, the harmless doodles increased. One day, Randall scribbled his phone number beneath her name. Hani felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't interested, but more than that, she felt uncomfortable. She approached the counter, politely and softly rejecting his offer. Randall's face remained expressionless, robotic, as he simply nodded and muttered, "All right." Hani continued to visit Starbucks, hoping things would go back to normal. The hearts and doodles stopped, and Randall returned to his neutral, professional demeanor. Everything seemed fine until one day, she agreed to meet someone new she had been dating for coffee at the Starbucks she frequented, the same one where Randall worked. When Hani arrived, her date had already found a table. He politely offered to get coffee, so she stayed behind, waiting. When he returned, he seemed puzzled. He looked toward Randall and said, "The guy at the counter was rude." Hani glanced over and saw Randall glaring at her and her date, his face twisted in anger. It was the first time she had seen any emotion on his face. Something wasn't right. She could feel his gaze burning into her for the rest of the date, making her feel awkward and uneasy. That night, Hani returned home, sitting on her couch, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling, but her mind kept replaying Randall's angry stare. Suddenly, there was a loud, frantic knocking at her door. Hani cautiously walked to the door, peering through the peephole. Her blood ran cold. Randall was standing outside, his face twisted with fury, pounding on the door. Randall yelled, asking if the man she met was inside with her, his words sounding like a threat. She didn't understand what he was saying. He kept muttering that he knew she and the man were in there, slamming his body against the door, making it shake. Hani's heart raced. She backed away, rushing into the kitchen to grab a knife, the only means of defense she had. She sprinted into the bathroom, locking herself inside, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. From behind the bathroom door, she could hear Randall pounding on the front door. Her breath caught in her throat as the door began to splinter. She could hear him now moving through her apartment, his heavy, deliberate footsteps. Hani crouched in the tiny bathroom. It was pitch black, with only a sliver of light coming from under the door. The heavy footsteps, the occasional loud thud as Randall moved around her apartment, made it impossible for her to breathe. Randall moved, knowing she was hiding somewhere. He kicked open doors, searched behind furniture, his frustration growing. He yelled again and again, filled with rage and desperation. "Where are you, Hani?" She glanced at her phone. The 911 call had been connected, but it was hard to focus. The dispatcher reassured her that the police were on their way, but every second felt like an hour. She couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't arrive in time. Randall's footsteps suddenly stopped. He stood just outside the bathroom door, his shadow faintly visible under the gap. Hani's heart skipped a beat. She knew he was right there. Randall spoke softly, almost sweetly, saying he wouldn't hurt her, that he just wanted to talk. She placed her hand over her mouth, trying to stay silent, but her body trembled uncontrollably. A sudden loud bang rattled the door as Randall pounded on it. Hani flinched, her back pressed against the cold tiles. The door creaked, but it held firm. His voice began to shout, losing any calmness, boiling over with rage. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying the door would hold until someone arrived. But the pounding continued, relentless, and the wood started to splinter. Red and blue lights flickered off the buildings as police cars sped down the quiet street. The bathroom door was barely holding on. One more hit, and it would collapse. Annie's mind raced. If the door gave way, there was nowhere else to go. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, but they weren't close enough. She needed to stay calm. The final blow came, and the door flew open. Randall stood there, panting, his eyes wild and unhinged, gripping a small crowbar. He stepped forward, blocking the exit. Hanny gripped the knife, her only line of defense. He started questioning Hanny about why she didn't call him and talked about how she intentionally ignored him and threw him away for someone else. Hanny raised the knife, her hand trembling, her body frozen in fear. Randall stepped closer, his eyes locked on her. The police burst through the front door of the apartment building, guns drawn, rushing up the stairs. The narrow hallway echoed with their hurried footsteps. Just as Randall lunged, Hanny closed her eyes and screamed. But before he could reach her, a loud noise erupted. The front door flew open, and the commanding voices of the police filled the apartment. The police had arrived. Randall froze. His moment of control shattered. He turned, hesitating as if calculating something. Hanny seized the opportunity, thrusting the knife forward in defense, forcing him to step back. Randall stumbled out of the bathroom, his face twisted in fury. But it was too late. The police had entered the apartment, guns aimed at him. He glared at them, the madness in his eyes blazing intensely. He dropped the weapon, the small crowbar clattering to the floor. The officers rushed in, tackling him to the ground and handcuffing him. Throughout the entire process, his eyes never left Hanny. Hanny sat on the couch, her body still trembling. The apartment was now filled with police officers, investigators, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the terror of the night still fresh. One of the officers stood beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, reassuring her that she was safe and that they had caught him. She nodded, but the fear still lingered. Hanny stood by the window, watching the flashing lights fade into the distance. She exhaled deeply, her body finally beginning to relax. Randall was gone, arrested, and taken away. But Hanny knew she would never forget the horror of that night. The nightmare might be over, but the fear would remain, an ever-present shadow in her mind. The madness of the masked man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it. But as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, A shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips as if daring her to approach.
Come outside, Susan.
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan, I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
"Jeff?"
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
"What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?"
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily. As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. The Intruder and Courage. Nicky recalled when he was 9 years old, his parents adopted a dog, wanting him to grow up with a companion to help him learn boundaries and discipline, as well as have a playmate. The dog's name was Charlie, a golden retriever. One night, Nicky woke up past midnight and noticed that Charlie had jumped off the bed and was whining at the door. Nicky got up and went downstairs with Charlie. As he walked through the living room, he felt something pass by him that he couldn't even recognize. Nicky led Charlie out into the backyard and stood by the door, waiting for Charlie to quickly finish and come back inside. But when Charlie came back inside, he turned toward the garage door, walked over, and began sniffing intensely. Soon, Charlie's usual curiosity shifted to something else. He began whining, pacing, and scratching at the door more aggressively, finally looking back at Nicky. Nicky hesitated, but Charlie wouldn't stop. Finally, Nicky opened the door and turned on the light. When the lights came on, there was a man wearing a black mask and dressed in all black, trying to break into Nicky's dad's Mercedes. Beneath him was a black bag full of stolen items. The man turned, startled by the light. Charlie immediately began barking, his deep, ferocious growls echoing through the garage. Nicky screamed for his parents, but within moments, the man reacted quickly, rushing over to grab him and cover his mouth. Charlie barked even louder, his desperation clear as he tried to protect Nicky. "Quiet," the man hissed, dragging Nicky toward the car. Charlie lunged, but the man kicked him out the door, sending him sprawling to the ground. His whimpers filled Nicky with heartbreak. Then the thief threw Nicky hard to the ground, leaving him weak and powerless. He leaned down, threatening him to stay quiet or else. After a moment, Charlie was on the other side of the door, barking again. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention back to the car, using a metal tool to try and pry the lock. Nicky sat frozen, trembling as Charlie's relentless barking continued. Moments later, the door burst open, and Nicky's parents rushed in with Charlie. Nicky's father's face contorted with anger as he took in the scene. "Let my son go," he shouted. The man turned around, grabbed Nicky, and put him in a chokehold. Nicky's father froze, and his face shifted from anger to immediate panic. It wasn't clear why until Nicky realized there was a knife pressed against his neck. The man demanded his parents step back, hand over the car keys, and let him drive away, or else he'd hurt the boy. Nicky's mother tightly held onto Charlie's collar, trying to restrain him as the dog growled and struggled against her grip. "Get the keys," Nicky's father said, his voice tense with fear. Nicky's mother turned toward the house, but her grip on Charlie slipped. The dog broke free and charged toward Nicky. The thief removed the knife from Nicky's neck, and the boy instinctively knew he would point it at Charlie. Acting on instinct, Nicky grabbed the knife and pulled it toward himself, the blade slicing through his fingers in agonizing pain. Charlie lunged forward. His jaws tore through the man's pants and clamped tightly onto his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Nicky's father immediately charged at the thief, pulling Nicky and Charlie away from him. Before the thief could react, his protective instincts took over, and he pinned the intruder to the ground, knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until Nicky's mother intervened that everything finally settled. Nicky could barely recall what happened next. All he knew was that the thief spent a long time in the hospital before being taken into custody. Nicky was also relieved that everyone, including Charlie, escaped without serious injury. Even though Charlie was older, he had proven his boundless love and loyalty to Nicky and the family. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still, and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Vengeance of the soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there. Haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, The echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one, but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks, and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner, and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m., when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
"Did you forget something? Don't joke like that."
But no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
"You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining."
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. Mysterious guest at the gas station. Kevin, working at a local gas station, was accustomed to the quiet routine of the night shift. This time, he was covering for someone else, starting from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. He sat behind the counter as heavy rain poured outside, with a major storm looming. Most people seemed to be staying indoors. After sitting inside for an hour, Kevin put on a raincoat and went outside to tidy up and prepare for the approaching storm. As Kevin gathered the last few items, he noticed a man not too far from the gas station. The man was pacing along the roadside, soaked to the bone. It was unusual, though it seemed he might just be waiting for a ride. 2 hours later, thunder began rumbling in the distance, followed by strong winds and heavier rain that shook the building. Realizing the intensity, Kevin rushed to lock the doors and move to the storage room for safety. About 30 minutes into the storm, it took him several moments to realize that someone was banging on the front door. He left the storage room to check. Someone was outside, looking in and pounding on the door repeatedly. It was a man, and Kevin quickly rushed to unlock the door, thinking the man was in trouble and needed help. The man was soaked. He rushed inside without saying a word and began pacing back and forth across the floor, leaving puddles of water in his wake. Kevin tried asking if he was okay or needed help, but the man just stared with a vacant, hollow expression. Kevin thought it best to stay cautious and alert. The situation became uncomfortable. As the man paced around, Kevin realized he might be dangerous and decided to observe him patiently. The man's drenched coat revealed patches of mud and scratches, and there was a faint metallic smell of blood. His hand showed large, dark bruises. A gut feeling told Kevin that this man might have been involved in some violent incident. His appearance and behavior raised alarm bells in Kevin's mind. Though uneasy, Kevin decided not to escalate the situation, hoping the man would eventually calm down or leave. But the tension only grew as the storm intensified, leaving Kevin to think about his next move. The man seemed oblivious to everything, pacing around and mumbling incoherently. Occasionally, he cast strange glances at Kevin whenever he reached for his phone. Kevin noticed mud on the man's shoes and realized it was clay. He was familiar with it because customers often tracked it in on rainy days. It was a specific type of clay found near a construction site a few miles away. Kevin decided to act.
Would you like some coffee?
He asked, keeping his tone calm. At first, the man hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Kevin poured a cup and handed it to him. The storm outside seemed to be subsiding. While the man was distracted, Kevin quickly scribbled a note under the counter that read, "Call the police," waiting for an opportunity. Luckily, a delivery driver passed by and entered the store. Kevin discreetly signaled to him and handed him the note along with an item. The driver glanced at the note and nodded at Kevin before leaving. The man's behavior became more erratic. He started mumbling to himself. Kevin sensed that the man was on the verge of losing control. The man grew agitated, complaining about a woman who wouldn't stop screaming and how he had to make her quiet. Kevin pieced it together. The missing woman he'd heard about recently could likely be his victim. Kevin used the storm to create a distraction. When lightning struck and the lights flickered, he toppled a stack of metal shelves, startling the man. Amid the chaos, Kevin grabbed a wrench to defend himself if necessary. The man stumbled, spilling his coffee, and Kevin used the confusion to edge closer to the exit. Moments later, red and blue lights reflected off the rain-splattered windows. The police had arrived, tipped off by the delivery driver. The man tried to flee, but was quickly subdued. Kevin led them to the construction site. He deduced from the man's mud-caked, clay-covered shoes. There, they found the missing woman alive, though bound and hidden in an abandoned shed. Relieved to see her taken to safety, Kevin stood in the rain, trembling. The storm had passed, but its horrors lingered. Kevin finished his shift in silence. The guest at midnight. A few years ago, Jacob applied for a temporary job at a local gas station. He planned to move in 6 months, so he couldn't get a long-term job, but he still needed to make some cash beforehand. The job paid well enough to convince Jacob to take the night shift. All he had to do was man the register and occasionally handle routine maintenance. It was during his 4th month on the job. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one particular customer that stood out to Jacob. His name was Dave. He was a man in his early 40s who regularly stopped by the gas station around 1 or 2 a.m. every night. He would walk in and buy random things, sometimes household items, food, or tools. Occasionally, the things he purchased seemed oddly specific. One night, as usual, at 1 a.m., Dave entered the gas station. There were no other customers, just Jacob, sitting at the counter, waiting for him to walk in. Jacob immediately sensed something was off. Dave looked disheveled, sweating, and frantically searching for something. When he found it a master lock, the kind used for securing bikes, he rushed to the counter and tossed it down for checkout. Dave's strange behavior only made Jacob more curious.
Dave, did you get a new bike?
But Dave didn't even look at him, hastily pulling out cash instead. The night passed, and then several days did too. Jacob hadn't seen Dave in nearly a week, which was strange, considering Dave usually came in every night. It wasn't until Jacob's 4th shift that he saw Dave again. That night, a light drizzle fell outside. As usual, Dave stepped into the store. But this time, he rushed inside, muttering something inaudible. He looked agitated, and Jacob felt an unsettling sense of unease. His gut told him something was wrong. Then, a loud noise came from outside. The only thing there was Dave's car. The sound was sharp, like someone kicking the door from the inside. A second later, Jacob turned back to Dave. He was no longer in a rush. Instead, he stood in the aisle, staring directly at Jacob, like he had just realized something Jacob wasn't supposed to know. After that night, after seeing Dave's car and hearing that strange noise, Jacob knew he couldn't just sit still. He checked the gas station's security cameras, trying to figure out what Dave had been doing on his previous visits. Jacob recalled the items Dave had bought: rope, locks, duct tape. When put together, they all seemed to serve a sinister purpose. Determined not to let this go, Jacob decided to follow Dave. After tracking Dave's car several times, Jacob discovered that he frequently drove to a narrow forest road leading to an abandoned cabin near town. Choosing not to call the police just yet, Jacob drove there himself, bringing a flashlight and a folding knife for protection. As he neared the cabin, Jacob turned off his car's lights and stepped into the forest. Peering through a window, he saw Dave holding a knife, mumbling something to a woman tied to a chair. Jacob silently tried to find a way inside, but he accidentally kicked a log nearby, alerting Dave. He quickly ducked behind a pile of firewood, but Jacob didn't realize Dave had already spotted him. Before he knew it, Dave was right behind him, eyes wild, shouting,
"What the hell are you doing here?"
With no other choice, Jacob lunged at him, initiating a violent struggle. Dave swung his knife at Jacob, but he dodged and shoved him against the wall. The tied-up woman screamed, desperately trying to free herself. Distracted by her cries, Jacob was caught off guard as Dave landed a powerful punch, knocking him to the ground. As Dave charged forward to stab him, Jacob grabbed a nearby wooden plank and smashed it against Dave's head, making him stumble and drop the knife. But things weren't over yet. In the struggle, Dave tried to reach for the knife, but Jacob shoved him backward. He fell into an abandoned pit just outside the cabin. From above, Jacob watched as Dave lay motionless, his breaths growing weaker. Jacob freed the woman, and together they left, abandoning Dave to his fate in the darkness. His reckoning would come soon enough. Encounter with the stranger. Nana was driving alone on a deserted road late at night, eager to get home after a long day. She gripped the steering wheel tightly and turned on some music, hoping it would make the lonely drive a little less daunting. 15 minutes into her drive, the car jerked violently to one side with a loud bang. Her vehicle suddenly shuddered and came to a halt. She pulled over to the side of the road and realized she had a flat tire. Frustrated, Nana stepped out of her car to assess the situation. She crouched down to inspect the tire. It was completely flat. As she pondered how to handle the situation, a low whistle broke the silence in the distance. It was eerie and unsettling, especially considering the desolation of the area. Instinctively, her hand reached for the flashlight in her car trunk. She scanned the area and spotted a red Chevy parked under a tree. Nana checked her phone. It was 9 p.m. She wondered why someone would be whistling a romantic tune on such a deserted road. Even more troubling, she had no cell signal. Although her instincts told her to stay in the car, she thought maybe the owner of the car nearby could help with her flat tire. She began walking toward the sound. Just around the next bend, Nana stopped near a large tree surrounding a clearing. Beyond it was the edge of a cliff overlooking the starry sky. Nana saw a man and a woman sitting under the tree, seemingly sharing a romantic moment by a campfire. The man had his arm around the woman, her long blonde hair cascading over his shoulder. The man was whispering into her ear, and even chuckling softly. The night around them was eerily quiet, except for the rustling of leaves. She crept closer, hiding behind a tree, noticing something odd about the man's demeanor. His wide-eyed expression and erratic laughter sent chills down her spine. The man's voice broke the silence.
Do you ever wonder if the stars are watching us?
His tone was playful, but there was something darker beneath it.
They're so eager to meet you.
The woman didn't respond. His laughter grew louder, more maniacal. The strange atmosphere around them deepened. Nana tried to stay calm, but couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. A loud snap echoed as her shoes stepped on a branch. The man's head whipped around toward her. The firelight illuminated his face, streaked with blood, and his dark coat appeared damp and heavy. His eyes locked onto Nana's, unblinking with an empty calmness. A crooked smile stretched across his lips, as if he knew something. "Don't be afraid, little girl." Suddenly, he wrapped his arms around the woman and shoved her onto the ground. Her face finally revealed. Her pale face was streaked with congealed blood, her lifeless complexion suggesting she had been dead for hours. Nana stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The man's crooked smile widened as he stepped forward.
Wait,
He said,
I won't hurt you.
but his actions betrayed him. The man began sprinting toward her with terrifying speed. Nana ran back to her car, locking herself inside just in time. But the man stopped in front of her window. He peered inside, tilting his head unnaturally, his smile haunting. Then he raised a claw hammer in his hand and swung it at the window. She had never felt death so close. He raised the hammer again, and she knew the glass would shatter this time. But then headlights from a car suddenly illuminated the road. Distracted for a moment, the man turned and walked into the forest, leaving Nana terrified. Nana knew this was her only chance. She stepped out of the car, mustering all her courage, and flagged down an older man driving by, begging him to take her to the police station. The man was later caught in another state after attempting to abduct another victim. His name was Marty Caldwell, a psychiatric patient. He believed himself to be a messenger of the stars, tasked with purifying souls by ending their lives. Nana felt incredibly lucky if not. She might have met the same grim fate. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs, calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, She fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store had closed, and the eerie silence surrounded it. Lena was the night shift manager. Usually, everything was quiet, nothing ever happened, and she would just stock shelves in the still hours while the world outside slept. Her focus broke when she heard a faint tapping. It came from the front of the store. Leaving her cart behind, she walked toward the noise. Through the large glass windows, she saw a man. Lena approached the glass door and asked what he wanted. He demanded she open the door. His face was blank, void of a smile, his cold eyes staring directly at her. Lena told him the store was closed, and he couldn't stay there. As Lena turned to leave, a loud bang made her jump. The man's fists pounded against the glass again, and again, each time harder and angrier. This guy wasn't just some harmless wanderer. She pulled out her phone, showing him she was ready to call the police. Only then did he step back, his glare still locked onto her, seething with rage. Slowly, he walked into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in her chest eased slightly. He was gone. She put her phone away and tried to refocus on work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, they all faded from her mind as she lost herself in stocking shelves. But then, she heard a metallic snap, like something being torn apart. She abandoned her cart and rushed forward, fear surging in her chest. Her stomach dropped as she saw the glass door cracked open. The lock, the only thing keeping it secure, was gone. Lena spun around, sprinting toward the office, but froze in place. Standing just a few feet away, blocking her path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still that cold, dead, furious stare. Lena didn't think, she just ran. She burst through the door, the man right behind her. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting her as it came to a halt. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Lena stepped forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in the back of her head. Lena's body lurched forward, collapsing to the ground. She didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything faded into darkness. Lena woke up with a pounding headache, her wrists tightly bound behind her back. The truck bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. Her mind was hazy, disoriented. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. Lena started piecing it together. The man. The truck. Maybe she had been kidnapped. Lena knew she had to act quickly. She glanced around. The interior was pitch black. But then, she spotted a pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered metal pieces on the floor. Lena twisted her wrists, testing the restraints. They were tight, but there was just enough slack to give her hope. She could hear him muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. Lena took a deep breath, pushing down the rising panic. She needed to think. She needed to get out. Lena inched closer to the toolbox, searching for anything sharp. It was difficult, but she found a small metal shard. Awkwardly, Lena maneuvered her hands, rubbing the metal against the rope. Every pothole in the road sent jolts of pain through her, threatening to make her cry out and expose her escape attempt. Suddenly, she felt the rope loosen. A few more scrapes, and it snapped. Her wrists were free, but she couldn't move too fast. Lena glanced at the front seat, where she could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't noticed she was awake yet. She spotted the unlocked door. She needed a plan. The truck slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the back door open and leaped into the night. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her body as she tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a moment, she thought she wouldn't be able to move, but then the adrenaline kicked in. Lena staggered to her feet, sprinting into the dense darkness of the trees. Behind her, the old van screeched to a stop. She heard the man shouting, but she didn't look back. She just kept running. Branches scratched at her skin as she tore through the dense underbrush. Her mind teetered between fear and survival. She could hear the man coming. She couldn't let him catch her again. Ahead, she spotted a clearing and the faint glow of streetlights through the trees. A road. If she could reach it in time, she'd be safe. Lena burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving her arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded her, but she didn't care. She threw herself in front of the vehicle, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and she collapsed onto the pavement. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but Lena was too weak to respond. All she could do was whisper, "Help." The driver pulled out a phone and called the police. Through the haze of exhaustion, Lena could still make out the blurry figure of the man standing at the edge of the woods, staring at her with furious eyes. But he didn't come closer. Maybe he knew it was over. Lena was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. She later learned that the man had been handcuffed not far from where she had collapsed. He had been caught. The police assured her he would be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. Though she was safe, the thought still haunted her. What if she hadn't escaped? What if she hadn't been fast enough? The fear lingered at the edges of her mind, but she was alive. She had survived the night. Nightmare House on the Hillside. A new beginning Lucy, a 7-year-old girl, moved with her family to an old suburban house. It was a historic home built in the mid-1800s. The house was 2 stories tall with a basement below. Down there was a locked door leading to water tanks used to heat the house. Only her mother and the landlord had the key. They warned her never to go near it. Lucy never understood why her room was always colder than the others, even though it was right above the basement. At night, she often heard strange creaking sounds, as if someone were walking on the floor, whispers, and distant footsteps pacing in the living room. The house was old and worn. She also frequently saw wasps emerging from the attic, swarming as if drawn to something. She wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. Her parents often heard footsteps late at night, pacing endlessly, but they dismissed it as nothing. One night, she woke up with an eerie feeling as if someone was in the room with her. Lucy turned over and saw a boy, his face hidden in the shadows. He wore old-fashioned clothes and stood near her desk. Lucy sat up in bed. The boy spoke, asking if she wanted to play with him. She refused, saying it was too late and she didn't want to get in trouble. His expression changed. He looked angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished into the cold darkness of the room. Lucy ran to tell her mother, but she reassured her that it was just a dream. Still, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. The next night, it happened again, but this time, it was worse. She woke up, unable to move. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She stood on Lucy's bed, her bare feet pressing into the blanket, long nails cracked and jagged. The woman bent down, her tangled hair falling over Lucy's face. She couldn't see her features, her wild hair obscured them. Then the woman stared at her, with hollow, blackened eyes. Her breath, ice cold, brushed against Lucy's skin. Lucy sprang up, threw open the door, and rushed to her sister's room. Her baby sister was still asleep in her crib. She had to make sure she was safe. She turned back to the door and saw the woman slowly stepping toward her. As she passed the window, a flash of lightning struck outside. For a brief second, the woman vanished. With each flicker of light, she reappeared closer and closer. Lucy woke up drenched in sweat, trying to piece together what had just happened. She ran to her mother and told her everything. Her mother's face turned pale as Lucy spoke, but in the end, she simply said it was just a nightmare, a lie one she had been telling since they moved in. Within days, the family moved out. Lucy's mother never gave them a reason. It wasn't until years later that Lucy finally dared to ask. The landlord eventually admitted what had happened in that house long ago. A widowed mother and her 3 children had once lived there. Their family had been happy together. During the Civil War, the mother had become a widow, and she and her 3 children remained in the house for a long time. After her husband died in battle, her mind shattered. In a fit of madness, she killed everyone else in the family right there in the living room, before dragging them down to the water storage room in the basement, the very place they had been warned never to go near. This explained everything Lucy had experienced: the misplaced toys, the shifting objects in her room. The boy Lucy had seen was one of her children, still trapped in the house, searching for a companion or perhaps revenge. And the woman, the one who stood on her bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horror she had committed. Lucy often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in that house. Would they have become part of its story? Would the woman have done to them what she had done to her own children? She would never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she found herself thinking about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. The Curse of the Red Shirt Girl. Arthur was driving home from a friend's birthday party on a quiet night. The streets were empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the deserted roads. As he drove, he noticed a young girl standing alone by the roadside. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and wore a striking red coat over a white dress. To him, she looked beautiful, but as his car approached, she raised her hand, signaling for a ride. Arthur slowly pulled over and rolled down his window as she approached the car. The girl asked Arthur,
Sir, if you don't mind, may I have a ride?
He didn't think much of it and immediately agreed. She sat in the back seat. Feeling a little nervous, Arthur hesitantly asked her where she lived. She didn't say a word but handed him a small note. The address was written in faded ink, as if scribbled down years ago.
All right, what's your name?
Her lips barely moved as she whispered.
Mary Tellish.
A strange feeling crept over him. Something about her name seemed familiar, like a whisper from the past. Her expression never changed. He tried to ease the tension by asking about her interests. Her voice was flat.
I used to play with dolls when I was little, but I can't play with them anymore.
She smiled gently, but not in a normal way. It was unsettling, filled with sorrow.
They took them away from me.
Something about the way she spoke sent chills down Arthur's spine. They were nearing an old cemetery, its rusted iron gates glowing under the moonlight. Suddenly, Mary leaned forward. Mary asked him to stop at the cemetery gate. She placed her icy hand on his shoulder.
Please, take my coat and return it to my home as soon as possible.
For a brief moment, He swore her fingers didn't actually touch him. It was a strange, ghostly sensation. Before he could respond, she darted out of the car, heading toward the cemetery gates, leaving her red coat behind. The next day, Arthur arrived at the address. It was a large wooden house, located far in the quiet outskirts. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an elderly woman. He asked her about the woman he had met.
Ma'am, does Mary Tailish live here?
But then something unexpected happened. The woman suddenly burst into tears and invited him inside. The house was large and beautifully decorated inside. He noticed pictures of Mary. In every single one, she was wearing the same red coat. The woman began telling him about Mary. She was their daughter. One night, while she was on her way home, a group of men kidnapped her and took her away. The mother had been worried sick. 2 days later, the police found Mary's body. Her eyes and left arm were missing. Arthur was speechless. He had seen her eyes, her hands, her beating heart when she sat in his car. But in reality, Mary Tailish had been dead for years. Trying to remain calm, he handed them her coat, then left. As soon as he got into his car, he saw Mary again. But this time, she wasn't the same. She was no longer human. Her red coat still clung to her shoulders, but now it was tattered and soaked in something dark. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen, and she gave him a chilling smile before vanishing. Arthur tried to push it all out of his mind, but for days, he kept seeing Mary in every shadow, every reflection in the window. One night, he woke up in bed and saw her standing in the corner of his room. Her left hand was missing, a dark stain on her chest where something had been taken. She whispered,
"Arthur, you helped me."
Her freezing fingers touched his forehead. Suddenly, sharp pain, screams, and the sound of something being cut open filled his mind. He saw dark figures, their shadows stretching over a struggling girl. He felt her terror. Then he saw their faces, their eyes, staring directly at him. Then darkness. Arthur woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and decided to go to the police station. He thought they'd laugh at him, but instead, they pulled out old case files. It was all real, but they had never found the suspects. The news became a major headline. Arthur had, in some way, helped bring justice for Mary Tailish. There was a legend Arthur later found online. Anyone who meets Mary Tailish must help her, or they will meet a terrible fate. Luckily, Arthur had been kind to her. The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
"I see you."
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
"I see you."
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party, and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside, it still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
"Come closer."
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed, but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again. I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. The madman on the highway. This particular memory has haunted her with anxiety and panic for years. She was a single mother, working as an Amazon delivery driver to make ends meet. Lucy would drive to various delivery locations, and one time she was on the highway near midnight. The sky was overcast. Thunder rumbled around her, but the rain had yet to begin. The low fuel light flickered as a warning. The highway stretched ahead, desolate, surrounded by dense, dark forests. Lucy checked the map and saw a gas station 15 minutes away. She decided to take her chances, skipping a crowded one of the biggest mistakes she ever made. Following the GPS directions, she turned onto a dusty road surrounded by thick woods. The road was so uneven that speeding up was nearly impossible. Then, Lucy saw him. A man stood by the roadside, dressed in tattered clothes. His scarred, filthy skin glowed under the dim light as he stared at her. Thinking he might need help, she made her second mistake. She stopped the car, just a few feet away from the man. She rolled the window down slightly and leaned out.
Are you okay, sir?
The man didn't respond, but growled instead. His voice was strange, unlike anything she had ever heard. It was a broken, animalistic howl. Lucy stepped out of the car. That was her third mistake. As soon as she exited the car, the man took a few steps forward and then stopped. Lucy asked again if he needed help, but this time, something changed. The man crouched down like a predator about to pounce. Then, grinning wickedly, he got on all fours and started crawling toward her. Before Lucy could comprehend what the hell was happening, she bolted for her car. The man began crawling at her, faster than she thought possible. He kept crawling toward her, his sinister grin stretching wider. His unblinking eyes locked onto her. Panic surged through Lucy. She could hear his shrill laughter behind her. But before he reached her, she slammed the car door shut, locked it, and fumbled with trembling hands to start the engine. The condition of the road was terrible. Lucy didn't notice the large ditch on the right. Her car suddenly sped up. The right wheel slipped into the ditch, causing a violent jolt, trapping her vehicle. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead as she looked at the dusty road ahead, surrounded by the deep forest. The only way out now was to step out of the car. The hood of the car suddenly sank. Then, he jumped onto Lucy's hood, pressing his terrifying face against the windshield, grinning savagely. Lucy gagged. The sight was too much to bear.
The man laughed, his mouth wide open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. He whispered through the glass, his voice echoing in the air.
I'd love to torture you until you vomit blood.
Lucy's trembling fingers fumbled for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice quivered as she spoke to the dispatcher, pleading for help. She knew it would take at least 10 to 15 minutes for the police to arrive. As Lucy hung up, the man started climbing down from the hood. She checked all the doors, relieved that they were locked. He reached her window and tried to open the door. Then, he turned around and began searching for something on the ground. After a few minutes, he stopped and picked up a large rock. He hurled it at the window. The glass cracked under the impact, but did not shatter. Lucy screamed, gripping the steering wheel tightly.
Stop! Please! What did I do to you?
He just smiled, his eyes wide and wild, raising the rock again. Then, a loud sound car horns blaring, sharp and deafening. Bright headlights illuminated the crazed man. He froze, his expression turning blank, and slowly lowered the rock. The man locked eyes with Lucy one last time. He leaned closer to the window.
Looks like today is your lucky day. If you ever pass through here again, don't forget to pick me up.
He turned around and ran, disappearing into the forest. The truck pulled up beside Lucy's car, and the driver jumped out to help. The world blurred, then everything faded to black. Lucy had passed out in her car. That day, the police told Lucy they had found several abandoned vehicles left on the road by their missing owners. They had also received reports of 3 missing persons. They said they couldn't find anyone matching Lucy's description of the terrifying man. She didn't know where he was now, but for all delivery drivers and night travelers, the warning was clear: never stop for suspicious strangers, especially when driving alone in a desolate area. Haunting delivery trip. Lena was working for a food delivery platform on the weekends to earn extra money, juggling between her main job and side gig. It was past 9 p.m., with a light drizzle in the air. Lena started her shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After completing her first delivery, 20 minutes passed with no new orders. Then her phone rang with a new request. After picking up the order, Lena started driving. It was a quiet neighborhood, nothing unusual. As she approached a red light, she noticed a pickup truck pulling up beside her. Instinctively, she glanced over. The driver was leaning out of his window, staring directly at her car. When the light turned green, Lena stepped on the gas. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The pickup truck was now following at a distance. Lena tried to stay calm, but as she turned into the neighborhood, the pickup truck turned in as well. She thought maybe he lived there. Following the GPS, she arrived at the final street, but confusingly, it was a dead end. Lena hit the brakes, pulling over near the house she was supposed to deliver to. The pickup truck followed and parked right behind her. Lena sat there, trying to come up with a plan in case things took a bad turn. She wondered, what was this guy doing? Was he really following her? Lena glanced at her phone and saw a message from the customer. When will the food arrive? Could it be? Was he the customer? Lena felt trapped and helpless. Then, he stepped out of the truck, slowly approaching Lena's car. He stopped near the trunk, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Suddenly, he picked up a metal rod, and smashed it against her rear windshield, shattering the glass. Instinctively, she slammed on the gas. He leaped onto the back of her car, trying to crawl through the shattered window. Lena swerved sharply, throwing him off the car. She sped away, hands trembling as she grabbed her phone to call the police. But he wasn't going to let her escape that easily. The pickup truck was right behind her again, its headlights shining blindingly into her rearview mirror, making Lena squint. Suddenly, the truck lunged forward, ramming into the back of her car. The impact made Lena swerve, pain shooting through her ribs. Lena pressed the gas pedal hard, but the rain had made the road slick. She had to maintain control to avoid a crash. Panic flooded her as he pulled up alongside her, rolled down his window, and grinned a twisted, eerie smile. Then, another hit. The back of her car crumpled, and she felt something warm trickling down. Her forehead, her head had been injured in the collision. Dazed, Lena slammed on the brakes. With no other choice, she grabbed her phone again and called 911 for help. Through the rain, she could see his silhouette stepping out of the truck. Desperate, Lena floored the gas pedal and drove blindly. But moments later, her car slammed into a tree. She fumbled for the door handle, struggling to get out before he reached her. From a distance, she could hear him screaming in frustration. Despite the pain, she forced herself to run, sprinting toward the forest at the roadside. Lena tripped. Her ankle twisted, sending pain shooting up her leg, rendering her unable to move. He was almost on top of her as she desperately tried to crawl toward the roadside. Lena turned to face him. He raised a crowbar, and she screamed, thinking this was the end. But then, police sirens pierced through the quiet rain. He froze, ready to flee, but it was too late. The police fired a taser, bringing him down. At last, he was caught. Lena's vision blurred as she slipped into unconsciousness. Paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Relief flooded over her. The nightmare was finally over. The elevator of apartment 13. I had just moved into a new apartment building, a towering structure of steel and glass in the heart of the city. The building was modern, with sleek finishes, key-card access, and an array of amenities. But what attracted me most was the affordable rent, something almost too good to be true in this part of town. My apartment was on the 13th floor, which didn't bother me despite the superstitions surrounding that number. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was still settling in, getting used to the sounds of the city and the hum of the building. The neighbors were quiet, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways or elevator. However, I began to notice something strange about the elevator itself. Every time I used it, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor, and there was always a strange clicking noise just before the doors opened. One evening, after a long day at work, I stepped into the elevator, ready to unwind in my apartment. The elevator was empty, as usual, and I pressed the button for the 13th floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began its ascent. As I leaned back against the wall, I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator moving, but then, abruptly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight. The elevator jolted, and the lights came back on, dimmer than before. Help me! The floor indicator showed that I was between the 12th and 13th floors. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if under someone else's control. The air grew thick, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The clicking noise started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and the doors opened. I peered out into the hallway, which was eerily dark, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. My instincts told me to get out, but something held me back. There was a presence in the hallway, something unseen but undeniably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly pressed the closed door button, my hands trembling. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its descent, but the clicking noise didn't stop. It was almost rhythmic now, like footsteps above me. I stared at the ceiling, fear gripping me as the noise grew louder and faster. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 8th floor. The doors creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I slammed my hand on the buttons, desperate to get the elevator moving again, but it refused to respond. The shadow began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. Just as it reached the threshold of the elevator, the doors snapped shut, and the elevator plunged downward, faster than before. I held onto the railing, my heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise was now deafening, as if whatever was in the elevator shaft was right above me, following me. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to the lobby. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and looked back just in time to see the shadowy figure standing in the elevator, its hand outstretched as if reaching for me. The doors closed, and the elevator ascended again, disappearing into the darkness of the shaft. Shaken, I reported the incident to the building management, but they found nothing wrong with the elevator. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in that elevator, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the living. To this day, I avoid elevators, especially in old buildings, and I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, oppressive presence in the apartment building of 13. It was a reminder that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening, I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. Train to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, The thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure.